As I said at the beginning of the service, talking to the people worshiping from home, we are committed to not only reaching out and to building this online community of worshipers, but we at Godalming United are committed to making sure that our worship is accessible to as many people as possible. So as I said, as the lockdown ended and the lockdown restrictions ended, we have continued to live stream our worship, to do what we can to include those people in our service. We usually have about 15 to 18 people joining us there live, along with whatever's going on in the sanctuary. We post the videos on YouTube for people that aren't available on a Sunday morning. And during the course of an average week, about 20 people catch up on the service through that. And finally, we print a transcript of the service for those who are shut in and don't have internet access. Now, that's a small number anymore, but I think there's usually 5 to 10 people a week that receive this transcript. And it's this last method that has inspired my sermon this morning. Now, for the transcript, naturally we don't have a stenographer sitting here in the service, so Richard uses a bit of software that does the transcript automatically. And as you can imagine with software, the accuracy of it is a bit, well, let's say varied. I think about 95% of the time it's okay, but there are some mistranscriptions, and they can be rather amusing. For instance, every week when I talk about Molly going out to waysiders, it doesn't recognize that word because that's not a word that's in the dictionary. And so oftentimes they're going out to waysiders, or even worse, waste-siders, which I've been in enough pubs to know that's a cardinal sin in this country. Sometimes it even messes up the name of our church. Godalming United has had all kinds of different names. Mine and Richard's favorite is Goblin United. It's not all proper nouns, though. One week I said at the start of our service, and what the software heard was at the Star Trek service. We can only imagine what that would look like. A few weeks ago, the transcription software had a particularly bad day. I don't know that it had more mistakes than usual, but they were definitely more amusing than usual. I didn't go back to listen to what was supposed to be said, but some of the things that it heard was, "Marry me when she's gone. Good day." A few minutes later, "Shinto days through the glass, glory and praise to the ground." It almost sounds Zen, doesn't it? There was one, though, that week that I really, really liked. It said, "The version of God, the 3 a.m. one, be upon us." Now that is amusing, but at the same time, when Richard showed me that one, my first reaction was, that'll preach. There's an old proverb that says that it's always darkest before the dawn. But scientifically speaking, that isn't really true. Instead, scientists tell us that the darkest time of the night is the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 a.m. And I know this. I became very acquainted with those hours 14 years ago when this little peanut was born. We were having a meeting at church to talk about what was coming up for Holy Week and Holy Weekend. And Kyla was 8 months pregnant at that time, so she was about a month out. Easter was 2 weeks out. I told them that, of course, everything was subject to when Elizabeth decided to arrive. And these ladies at the church that have had years' experience all assured me at that meeting, down to a one, the first one is never early. I remembered that 12 hours later when we were driving to the hospital because Lizzie was on her way. And Lizzie not only was born the week before Holy Week, but Lizzie demanded to be held 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, with our second child, with Molly, when Molly cried, we knew we could put her down and she would stop eventually. But with Lizzie, we were new parents. We were scared. We were nervous. And so we held her all the time. And we slept in 3-hour shifts for the first month. I know it sounds ridiculous now. I'm even embarrassed to admit it. But we had no idea what we were doing. So my Easter sermon that year, all of Holy Week, midterms for seminary, all were written between the hours of 4 and 8 a.m. back in 2008. And so I know that those hours before the dawn may not be the darkest, but there are times when they can seem the most helpless and the most hopeless. It seems that in those late hours of the night that it's so easy to despair. At this time when we're most physically and psychologically tired and vulnerable. Maybe you've experienced this at some point in your life. Maybe you've been up all night comforting a crying child. And in those hours, it seems that they'll never go to sleep. Maybe you've spent those hours in a hospital, sitting by the bedside of a loved one, wondering whether they'll live to see the sunrise. Maybe you've been mourning the recent loss of a loved one, unable to sleep, sitting by the window, waiting for the sun to come up. If you've ever experienced any of those things, then perhaps you know a bit of what Mary Magdalene and the other women felt as they journeyed to the tomb that morning. It was a sad labor of love that had brought them there in those pre-dawn hours, and the wound must have still been fresh on their hearts. Their friend, their rabbi, their leader had been executed on Friday afternoon. And because the Sabbath began at sunset on Friday, they'd been unable to perform the customs that were demanded at the death of a friend or a family member. In Jewish custom, the body was to be washed thoroughly and then wrapped in a linen cloth, the grave clothes. But because of the lateness of Jesus' death, there had not been time to properly wash the body before his interment. He had been placed in what was probably a simple shroud and placed humbly in the tomb as quickly as they could before the sunset. And so they return to the tomb on Sunday, the first day of the week, the first day after Sabbath, to perform their final duty to their teacher. They go in the pre-dawn hours because the obligation has been put off long enough. They want to make sure that these things are settled as quickly as possible. And so we can still imagine their grief and their despair as they made their way to the cemetery in the dark. We can imagine their grief and despair, but they could not imagine what they would find when they arrived at the grave. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy Jewish man who had been a follower of Jesus' teachings. And when they came to his tomb, they found that the stone, the door to it, had been rolled away. Now, at this time, their worst fears must have seemed to be realized. Because while Jesus was popular among the people, he was a threat to the political and the religious leaders. And so their immediate thoughts would have been that his body had been stolen, desecrated, hidden so that his followers couldn't find him. Perhaps if they were strictly following the religion of Judaism, they would have worried that without a body, Jesus wouldn't have even have been able to rise in the final resurrection of the dead. So they run. They look in the tomb, and they see nothing but a discarded set of grave clothes. The same shroud that Jesus had been buried in 2 days before. And as they stand there gaping, 2 angels appeared before them. "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" one of them asks. "Remember how he told you that he must be crucified and on the 3rd day be risen again?" There was some rebuke in the angel's words. Jesus had told his followers more than once that he would suffer and die and be raised from the dead. And even though they believed Jesus to be the Messiah, they had forgotten his words. But now, the sun has risen. Now, the dawn has come. And we come now to the meat of this gospel story, the lessons that we are to take from it. What was the first thing that the women did after speaking to the angel? They ran and told the disciples. You see, the tomb was not open so Jesus could get out. We see later in the Gospels, Jesus was able to appear in a locked room where the disciples were staying. Rather, the stone was rolled away not so that Jesus could get out, but to let the witnesses in. "Come and see," this tomb is saying. "He is not here, but go and tell he is risen." This is the Easter mandate for the church. We have experienced a risen Christ, and we cannot keep this information to ourselves. It has to be shared with the world, even though the world will not always want to hear it. Even the disciples didn't want to hear it at first. It says that the men didn't believe the women. They thought that it was an idle tale, a rumor, a gossip. They didn't believe that the women had seen it with their own eyes. 2 of the disciples, Peter and John, though, felt it was at least worth checking out. It says that they ran to the tomb, but it still doesn't say that they believed. After all, an empty tomb proves nothing. All it proved was that the body was gone, stolen for all they knew. The empty tomb alone does not produce faith. Instead, it is only by encountering the living Jesus that the disciples could believe in him. It's only by encountering the living Jesus that we can believe in him. That is what happened to Mary Magdalene after Peter and John leave. The Gospel of John tells us that Mary Magdalene stayed at the tomb that second time, and as she lingered there weeping, Jesus himself appeared to her, and it says that she then believed that he was risen. Now we have to be honest and say that we today cannot see the tomb of Jesus. We are not 100% sure where it is, despite what documentaries, filmmakers, even tradition says. What we do have, though, is the testimony of the witnesses found in the Bible. We have the testimony of our own encounters with the risen Christ. And we live out our faith today knowing personally that he is alive in us. The Easter mandate is to go and tell others that Christ is alive in us. Come and see, go and tell. Jesus' resurrection brought a community into existence. It's a personal faith, an individual faith, but it's not meant to be a personal secret. The church is about community and inviting others into that community. It's about bringing direction to those who are lost. About bringing hope to those who have none. Going back to those first few weeks with Elizabeth, we learned something about those pre-dawn hours. And that's that they're not as bad as they seem. At 3 a.m., holding a squalling infant, I had to admit that I felt that I would never have a good night's sleep again. But I did. In the middle of the night, sitting by a loved one's bedside, it seems as if there is no hope. But there is. As the sun peeks over the horizon, the widow or the widower sitting in the chair wonders if they will ever feel alive again. But they will. It turns out that there are some pretty wonderful things that can come from the God of 3 a.m. Things may seem darkest in the middle of the night or just before the dawn. But either way, we know that the dawn is coming. In light of the day, we regain hope, we reclaim life, we renew our faith. He is risen. He is risen indeed.